My husband found out I was pregnant and said, "That's not my child, get out of my house." But 2 days later, I got a call from a lawyer. "Ma'am, your first husband from 2015 left you $45 million, but there is one condition." Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that the hardest thing about being married was learning to share a bathroom with someone. I know how naive that sounds now. But when you're 34 years old working as a mid-level project coordinator at a logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you finally built something that looks, from the outside, like a real life, a townhouse with a vegetable garden in the back, a dog named Biscuit, a husband who grills on Sundays, you let yourself believe that the hard part is over. Derek and I met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in the fall of 2019. He was good-looking in an easy, unremarkable way. Sandy hair, broad shoulders, the kind of smile that made waitresses refill his coffee without being asked. He sold commercial real estate and was good at it, which meant he was good at making people feel like the most important person in the room. I should have recognized that skill for what it was. Instead, I called it charm. We dated for a year and a half, moved in together in early 2021, and married in June of that year. Small ceremony, backyard of his parents' house in Concord. Derek's mother, Linda, presiding over everything like she was the bride. I noticed that, too, at the time, and filed it away under things we'll work out later. Linda Monroe was not a woman who shared space easily. She had opinions about how I loaded the dishwasher, how I seasoned chicken, how I said "you guys" instead of "y'all." She never said she didn't like me outright. She didn't need to. For almost 2 years, the marriage was fine. Not transcendent, not the kind of love people write songs about, but solid and warm in the way that a good coat is warm. Functional, reliable, enough. Derek worked long hours. I worked long hours. We had dinner together most nights, watched television, took a trip to Asheville in the spring. I told myself this was what adult love looked like after the infatuation settled. The first warning sign, when I look back, was the phone. Derek had always been protective of his phone. He called it a work habit, said his clients expected privacy. I accepted that without examining it, the way you accept a lot of small things in a marriage, because examining them feels like distrust. But sometime in the late summer of 2022, something shifted. He started leaving the room to take calls. He started coming home later, not by hours, but by increments. 15 minutes, then 30, then an hour. Always with explanations that were just plausible enough to not challenge. A showing that ran long. Traffic on 85. A client dinner he'd forgotten to mention. The second warning sign was the distance in bed. Not immediately dramatic, just a gradual cooling. Like a room where someone has quietly turned down the thermostat by 1 degree every few days, until one morning you realize you're cold and you can't remember when it happened. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was stressed. I told myself a lot of things that autumn. Then, in October, I found out I was pregnant. I was 8 weeks along when I told him. I had rehearsed it. The tone of voice, the moment, even which kitchen I'd tell him in. I chose a Thursday evening after dinner when the dishes were done and Biscuit was asleep in his corner and everything in the house was quiet and ordinary. I sat across from Derek at the kitchen table and I told him. I watched his face. There are expressions that rearrange themselves quickly, the way a person will adjust their features when they realize they've reacted in a way they didn't intend. Derek's face did not do that. It went still. Not surprised, still. Closed. Still. The way a door goes still after it's been locked from the inside. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "That's not my baby." I heard the words, but it took a moment for them to arrive. "What?" "You heard me." He stood up from the table. He didn't raise his voice. That was almost the worst part. How measured he was. How completely certain, as if he'd been waiting for this moment and had already decided how it would go. "That's not my child, Claire, and I want you out of this house." "Derek, I'm serious. I want you out." I stood there in my own kitchen, the kitchen where I had cooked 1,000 meals, where we had argued about grocery lists and laughed about nothing, and once danced badly to a song on the radio at 2 a.m. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was looking at a stranger. Not a man who had lost his temper, not a man who was scared, a man who had made a decision, and this was the execution of it. I left that night with 2 bags and my dog. I drove to my best friend Karen's apartment on the other side of the city and sat in her guest room in the dark, listening to Biscuit breathe on the floor beside me, trying to understand how I had arrived here. I was 8 weeks pregnant. I had a mortgage I couldn't cover on one salary, and my husband of 2 years had just told me, without flinching, that my child wasn't his. I didn't know yet that 2 days later, everything would change, that a phone call from a lawyer I'd never heard of would upend the ground beneath me completely, and that the man who had thrown me out of my own home had just made the single worst decision of his life. I didn't sleep that first night at Karen's. I lay on the pull-out sofa with Biscuit pressed against my legs, and I stared at the water stain on the ceiling, and I did what women do when their lives collapse without warning. I ran the numbers. The townhouse was in both our names, purchased in 2021 with a down payment that Derek had provided, and a mortgage we split evenly. My name was on the deed. That was something. My salary was $61,000 a year before taxes, and with Charlotte's cost of living and a baby coming, it was not enough to be something. My savings account held 9 months of emergency fund, about $14,000, which had felt responsible and even a little impressive 3 days ago, and now felt like a sandcastle. I had health insurance through my employer. That was something too. I had a husband who had just accused me of infidelity without a shred of evidence in front of no one as a way of disposing of me, and I had not yet cried. I noticed that. The grief was there. I could feel it sitting in my chest like something swallowed wrong, but it hadn't broken the surface yet. What was on the surface was something colder and more focused, something that was starting, very quietly, to look like anger. Karen made coffee at 6 a.m. and sat across from me at her small kitchen table without asking questions, which is why she's been my best friend since college. She waited until I was ready. "He didn't even ask," I said. "He didn't ask me anything. He just decided." "I know. I haven't been with anyone else. This is his baby." "I know that too." "Why would he—" I stopped, because I was already starting to understand why, even if I didn't have all the pieces yet, a man who is faithful doesn't jump immediately to "that's not my baby." A man who is pulling away for months doesn't do it without a reason. The phone calls, the distance, the incremental absences, they hadn't been about stress or work or anything I had been willing to name out loud until now. There was someone else. I didn't have proof yet, but I knew. I was still sitting at Karen's kitchen table, turning that knowledge over in my mind like a stone, when my phone rang. The number had a Charlotte area code, but I didn't recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. I still don't know why I picked up. "May I speak with Claire Monroe?" A man's voice, professional and unhurried. "This is she." Mrs. Monroe, my name is Gerald Fitch. I'm an attorney with Fitch and Callaway here in Charlotte. I apologize for calling at this hour. I've been trying to reach you for several days." A brief pause. "This concerns the estate of Thomas Ellery." The name moved through me like cold water. Thomas Ellery had been my first husband. We married in 2013 when I was 25 and reckless in the particular way that young women are reckless when they fall in love with someone older and brilliant and slightly broken. Thomas was 41, a self-made man in the truest sense. He'd built a small regional freight company from nothing over 20 years, quietly and without fanfare, and by the time I met him, it was worth considerably more than it looked from the outside. We were married for 2 years. He was kind, and we were genuinely fond of each other, but we were wrong for each other in ways that only became obvious slowly, and we divorced in 2015 without bitterness. He moved to Raleigh. I moved on. Thomas had died in August. A heart attack, sudden and without warning, at 63. I had read the obituary online and felt the particular grief of someone who has loved a person and then lost them in the smaller sense before losing them in the final one. I sent flowers to his sister. I did not hear from anyone. "I'm aware that Thomas passed," I said carefully. "Yes, ma'am. What you may not be aware of is that Mr. Ellery's will, finalized in 2021, designates you as the primary beneficiary of his estate." Gerald Fitch paused again, in the way that lawyers pause when they are about to say a number. The estate is valued at approximately $45 million. I sat very still. Karen across the table looked at my face and set down her coffee mug. "There is, however, a condition," he continued. "What condition?" "In order to receive the bequest, you must not be legally married at the time of disbursement. Mr. Ellery's language is specific. The inheritance transfers only if you are single, divorced, or widowed at the point of claim. He stipulated a 90-day window from the date of formal notification, which begins today." Another pause. I recognize this may be a complicated time to receive this kind of news. I almost laughed. Complicated. I was pregnant, homeless in every practical sense, and my husband of 2 years had just accused me of carrying another man's child. And now a man I had loved a decade ago had left me $45 million, contingent on me being exactly what Derek had just tried to make me, alone. Derek had thrown me out of my house thinking he was punishing me. He had handed me the key to everything. I told Gerald Fitch I would call him back within 24 hours. I hung up the phone. I looked at Karen, and for the first time since Thursday evening, something that was not grief and not fear moved through my chest. I had a plan. Gerald Fitch's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on South Tryon Street, the kind of office that had real art on the walls and a receptionist who offered you sparkling water when you sat down. I arrived the following Monday morning in the best blazer I owned, with a legal pad and a voice recorder app open on my phone, and I sat across from a trim, gray-haired man in his 60s who had the calm of someone who had delivered life-changing news to people many times and had learned to do it without drama. He walked me through the will slowly and carefully. Thomas had updated it in March of 2021, 3 months before my wedding to Derek, which meant Thomas had known. He had watched me move on, and he had made a choice. Gerald explained that Thomas had never remarried, had no children, and had been estranged from most of his family. His sister received a modest sum, a handful of charitable bequests, and then me. The condition was written in plain language, the bequest to Claire Ann Ellery, formerly Claire Ann Sayers, shall transfer in full only in the event that she is not party to a legal marriage at the time of disbursement. Thomas's attorney had prepared a brief explaining the most common interpretation of this clause. It was not punitive, Gerald said, it was protective. Thomas had wanted to ensure the money went to Claire, not to Claire and a husband he'd never met. He knew you, Gerald said simply. He wanted to take care of you. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the practical questions. Divorce timeline in North Carolina, at minimum 60 days from filing if uncontested, longer if contested. Gerald recommended I retain a family law attorney immediately. He gave me 2 names. I wrote them down. I called the first name on my lunch break. Patricia Odom, a family law attorney with 20 years of practice and the kind of measured directness I immediately trusted. We met that afternoon. I told her everything. She asked good questions about the mortgage, about assets, about whether Derek had ever been financially controlling or physically threatening. He hadn't. She told me that gave us a relatively clean framework to work with. She also told me something else. If the child is biologically his, which it is, he has legal obligations that begin at birth, regardless of the state of your marriage. Refusing to acknowledge paternity doesn't relieve him of anything. It just delays the inevitable and makes him look worse. He'll deny it, I said. He can try. We'll request a court-ordered paternity test. He won't have a choice. I left her office feeling, for the first time in a week, like the ground was something I could stand on. I had not told Derek about the inheritance. I had not told anyone except Karen, and I had asked Karen not to say a word. But the day after my meeting with Patricia, my phone rang with Derek's number, and when I answered, his voice had a quality I hadn't heard before. Not angry, not cold, careful. I heard you've been talking to a lawyer, he said. I kept my voice neutral. Who told you that? Doesn't matter. Claire, I think we should talk before either of us does anything we can't take back. That careful tone, that sudden interest in talking. He hadn't wanted to talk 4 days ago. He'd wanted me out of his house. Something had changed. Someone had told him something, or he had started to worry about something. I told him I'd think about it and hung up. It was Karen who gave me the first real piece of evidence. Not because she'd been looking for it, but because the world is small and Charlotte is smaller. Karen worked at a marketing firm in South End, and one of her colleagues had recently started dating a woman named Nicole Pratt, who worked in commercial real estate. Nicole Pratt, Karen told me, had been seen at a company event with Derek Monroe on her arm. In September, while we were still married, while I was still, as far as anyone knew, his wife. Karen sent me a photograph. It had been taken by her colleague at a rooftop event in early September. Derek and Nicole stood together in the way that people stand together when they are not bothering to pretend. Close, easy, his hand at the small of her back. He was smiling the same smile he'd used on me at that birthday dinner 4 years ago. I looked at that photograph for a long time. September was when the phone calls started. September was when the thermostat in our marriage started dropping. September was, I now understood, when Derek Monroe had found his exit and started planning it. He hadn't thrown me out because he believed my baby wasn't his. He didn't believe that. Or rather, it didn't matter whether he believed it. It was a pretext. It was the fastest, cleanest way to manufacture grounds to push me out the door so he could bring someone else in. He had used my pregnancy, our pregnancy, as the weapon. I forwarded the photograph to Patricia Odom with a 3-word message. This is Nicole Pratt. Patricia replied within the hour. Good. Keep everything. That evening, I sat in Karen's guest room with Biscuit at my feet and my legal pad in my lap, and I drew a line down the center of the page. On the left side, I wrote everything Derek had taken from me. On the right side, I wrote everything I intended to get back. The right side was longer. Patricia filed the divorce petition on a Wednesday morning, which was, she told me, with a calm she seemed to find professionally appropriate. Also, the same morning, Gerald Fitch submitted the formal inheritance notification to the estate's bank and trustee. The two events were not legally connected, but together they set something in motion that I could feel the weight of, like the first movement of a very large machine. I was at work when Derek called. I didn't answer. He called again. I forwarded both calls to Patricia's office as she had instructed me to do. That evening, he called from a different number, and I picked up by mistake. "You filed for divorce." His voice was stripped of the carefulness he'd used before. Underneath it was something rawer. "Without even telling me. You told me to leave your house," I said. "I'm leaving." "Claire." A pause. "What do you know about Thomas Ellery's estate?" There it was. He'd found out. I don't know how. Later, I would learn that Linda Monroe had a neighbor who worked adjacent to the financial services industry and had somehow pieced enough together to make a phone call. Charlotte is a small city in ways that matter. "I'm not discussing that with you," I said. "You're not thinking clearly. You're pregnant and stressed, and you're about to make a very serious mistake. Goodbye, Derek." He showed up at Karen's apartment building the next morning. He didn't get past the lobby. Karen's building required a key fob, but he stood outside the glass front door and called my phone 12 times between 7 and 8:30 in the morning, and I watched him from the second-floor landing window with my coffee cooling in my hand and Biscuit sitting very still beside me as if he understood something was wrong. Linda Monroe called me that afternoon. I had expected anger. What I got was performance. A particular kind of cold, theatrical composure that Linda had always been very good at. She told me she was sorry things had gotten to this point. She told me she'd always thought of me as family. She told me that a divorce would hurt everyone, including the baby, and that perhaps I should think carefully before involving lawyers in what was, at its heart, a private family matter. "Linda," I said, "your son told me my baby wasn't his and asked me to leave. Lawyers are already involved." The composure cracked slightly. "You should know that we have resources, Claire. Derek's firm has a legal team that deals with things like this, contested divorces, asset disputes." She paused. "And inheritance claims that may not be as straightforward as they appear." There it was. The threat underneath the sympathy. They were going to fight the divorce, contest the inheritance if they could find any angle, and make everything as slow and expensive as possible in the hope that I would run out of money or resolve before they did. I passed the threat along to Patricia Odom in a voice memo, calmly and in full detail, and Patricia told me what she had already told me. Our position was solid. The inheritance was not subject to Derek's claims. Thomas had been my ex-husband, the estate was entirely separate from our marital assets, and Derek had no legal standing to contest it. The divorce was straightforward on its face. No commingled business assets, a shared property that could be valuated and split, and an extramarital relationship that was documented. "Let them posture," Patricia said. "That's all they're doing." 2 days later, Derek came to Patricia's office, not with his firm's legal team, but alone, in the suit he wore when he wanted to be taken seriously, and asked to speak with me directly. Patricia relayed the request. I said no. He left a letter instead. It was 4 pages long, and it moved through several arguments. That I had misunderstood his reaction to the pregnancy. He'd been shocked, not accusatory. That the marriage was salvageable. that he wanted to be a father to his child. The letter did not mention Nicole Pratt. It did not mention his mother's phone call. It said in careful and lawyerly language that he was open to a negotiated resolution. I read it once. I gave it to Patricia. I went back to work. That Friday, I allowed myself something I hadn't in 2 weeks, a full day off. I drove out to Lake Norman with Karen and Biscuit, and we sat on the shore and ate sandwiches and didn't talk about Derek or Linda or inheritance law. Karen pointed at clouds and named them after things. That one looks like a Labrador. That one looks like Patricia Odom making a closing argument. And I laughed for the first time since October and felt the laugh move through me like oxygen in a space that had gone stale. I was 14 weeks pregnant. I was living in my best friend's spare room. I had 9 months of emergency savings and a potential inheritance I couldn't touch for 60 more days at minimum. But I had filed. I had moved. I had a lawyer, evidence, and a documented threat from my mother-in-law that Patricia was already describing as useful. Derek Monroe had tried to throw me away. Instead, he had shown me exactly what I was fighting and exactly why. I drove back to Charlotte with the windows down and the heat off and Biscuit's head in my lap, and I thought, this is not over, but I am not afraid. The Saturday after the lake, Derek came to Karen's building again. This time, he didn't call from the lobby. He texted me first. I'm outside. I just want 5 minutes, please. Karen looked at me over her cereal bowl. Your call, she said. I thought about it. Patricia had advised me not to meet with Derek without her present or without recording the conversation. I had a recording app on my phone, and Derek had, I noted, communicated via text, which meant his presence was already documented. 5 minutes in the lobby of an apartment building was not an ambush. It was information. I went downstairs. He looked tired. That was the first thing I registered. Derek, who had always been meticulously put together, looked like someone who had not been sleeping well. His hair was slightly off, his jacket wrinkled. He'd lost some of the easy confidence in his posture. He was holding coffee from a place nearby, and he held it out to me as I came through the door. And something about the gesture, the hope in it, the smallness of it, made me feel, just briefly, the ghost of something that might once have been tenderness. I did not take the coffee. Thank you for coming down, he said. You said 5 minutes. He exhaled. I've been thinking about what I said to you that night, about the baby. He met my eyes. I panicked. I said something terrible and I can't take it back. But I want you to know I know it was wrong. This is my child. I know that. I watched him. I had thought about this moment, about what I would feel if Derek Monroe stood in front of me and admitted he had been wrong. I had thought I might feel relief or grief or the pull of a door reopening. Instead, I felt very quiet, the way a house feels after everyone has finally stopped arguing. Why now? I asked. What? You've had 2 weeks. You texted me once. Why are you here now, this week, with coffee? He looked away. I heard about the estate. I know. Claire, I'm not... He stopped, started again. I'm not here because of money. I'm here because I made a mistake, and I don't want to lose my family. It was a good speech. It might even have been partially true. Derek Monroe was not, I think, a fully dishonest man. He was a man who had wanted something else and had chosen a coward's way out. And now that the way out had turned costly, he was reassessing. That is a recognizable human thing to do. It did not make it my problem. You should talk to my attorney, I said. I turned and went back inside. Back in Karen's apartment, I sat on the pull-out sofa, and I held my own hands for a while. Not because I was afraid, but because the encounter had used something up in me, some small remaining reserve of what if. It was gone now, spent. I was lighter for it. That week, I made 2 phone calls that changed the practical shape of my life. The first was to my mother in Greensboro, whom I had not told anything yet. My mother, Barbara Sayers, is a woman who does not panic easily. She raised 3 children on a schoolteacher's salary after my father's early death, and has a particular kind of spine that I think I inherited and spent 20 years not knowing I had. I told her everything in one long conversation. She was quiet for most of it. At the end, she said, "You're going to be fine. Do you need money?" "Not yet," I said. "Ask if you do," she said. "Don't be proud about it." The second call was to a therapist named Dr. Reeves, who worked out of an office in Dilworth and had a 6-week wait list that I somehow got onto because someone had canceled. I started seeing her on Thursday evenings. She did not tell me what to do or how to feel. She asked questions and listened and said, at the end of my second session, "You're not as fragile as you're afraid of being." And I drove home and cried in the parking garage for 10 minutes, not out of sadness, but out of something releasing. My mother drove down the following weekend and took Karen and me to dinner at a restaurant with good bread and no televisions, and my mother paid for everything and told Karen she was a good friend and told me she was proud of me. And I sat between the 2 women who had known me longest and felt for a few hours like something more than a person under siege. The estate's 90-day window was down to 48 days. The divorce proceedings were moving. Patricia had received Derek's attorney's first formal response. They were not contesting the divorce on principle, but they were disputing the property valuation and requesting delays. Patricia was not worried. I was not worried. Derek and Linda Monroe were circling, and I could feel it, the way you can feel weather changing before the rain arrives. But I had people now. My mother, Karen, Patricia Odom, Dr. Reeves. I had a child growing in my body and $45 million waiting on the other side of a 60-day clock. And I had, at last, the specific and clarifying knowledge of exactly what I was worth. Not to Derek, to myself. That felt on a Thursday evening in Karen's guest room with biscuit at my feet and the city quiet outside the window, like enough to go on. Linda Monroe requested a meeting on a Tuesday afternoon through Derek's attorneys, formally and in writing. The language was carefully chosen. She wished to speak with Claire privately, woman to woman, without lawyers present, in a neutral location of Claire's choosing. She was, the letter said, concerned about the well-being of her grandchild. Patricia read the letter and made the same expression she made when something was professionally interesting. "You don't have to go," she said. "I know," I said, "but I want to hear what she says." "Record it." Already planned. I chose a coffee shop on Central Avenue that I knew had good ambient noise. Not so loud you couldn't hear, not so quiet that a conversation would carry. I arrived 10 minutes early, chose a corner table with my back to the wall, and had my phone recording in my jacket pocket before Linda walked in. She looked exactly as she always had, immaculately dressed, silver hair precisely arranged, the particular posture of a woman who has never doubted her right to take up space. She sat down across from me and ordered herbal tea and spent the first 5 minutes asking about my health and the pregnancy with an attentiveness that would have fooled someone who didn't know her. I let her talk. "I want you to know," she said eventually, setting down her cup, "that whatever happens between you and Derek, this family will always have a place for that child. Family is everything to us." "I appreciate that," I said. She looked at me steadily. "I also want to speak plainly, because I think we're both adults, and I respect you enough for that." She folded her hands on the table. Thomas Ellery's estate is a complicated matter. There are questions about the condition attached to the bequest that our attorneys believe may have legal merit, the intent of a will, the circumstances of its drafting. Linda, I said, Thomas's will is unambiguous, and Derek has no standing to challenge it. She continued as if I hadn't spoken. What I want you to consider is this. If you were to withdraw the divorce filing, if you and Derek were to return to counseling, genuinely commit to the marriage, we would be prepared to help with the mortgage, with expenses, with whatever you need for the baby. The Monroe family takes care of its own. I looked at her across the table. She was offering me a managed version of my own life, a life in which I stayed married to a man who had tried to discard me, accepted financial support from his family as a substitute for dignity, raised my child under their roof and their terms, and surrendered the one thing that had come to me independent of any of them. She wasn't offering help. She was offering a cage with nicer furniture. "What about Nicole Pratt?" I asked. The change in her expression was small but complete, a slight tightening around the eyes. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." I kept my voice even. "I have a photograph of Derek and Nicole at a work event in September. My attorneys have it. Are you asking me to return to a marriage where your son is in a relationship with another woman?" "I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture," she said. Her voice had cooled by several degrees. "Derek made a mistake. Men do. It doesn't have to mean the end of a family." "What it means," I said, "is that Derek made his choices and now I'm making mine." Linda set down her teacup with a precision that was not quite a slam. "If you proceed with this divorce, we will use every legal avenue available to delay and contest those proceedings. The child's paternity, the estate's validity, the property valuation, all of it. It will take years and every dollar you have, and you'll spend the first years of your child's life in courtrooms." She paused. "Is that what you want?" I felt something move through me. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of fear, like seeing a shadow before the source of it. She meant it. The Monroes had money and connections and a family attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of prolonged unpleasantness. But here is what Linda Monroe had not understood, and perhaps had never understood about me. I am a woman who was raised by a school teacher on a single income in Greensboro, North Carolina, who watched her mother face hard things without flinching and understood that the way through a hard thing is not around it. "Yes," I said. "If that's what it takes, yes." She stared at me. Then she stood, collected her bag, and left without finishing her tea. I sat in that corner table for another 10 minutes after she walked out, my phone still recording, my coffee going cold in my hands. The shadow of fear was still there. I examined it carefully. It was real. The threat was real. The resources behind it were real. The possibility of a long and painful legal process was real, and I let it fuel me. I stopped at Patricia's office on my way back to Karen's apartment and played the recording in its entirety. Patricia listened without expression. When it finished, she said 2 words, "Perfect. Thanks." I drove home with the windows down, my jaw set, my hands steady on the wheel. Linda Monroe had come to break me. She had handed me instead a recorded threat, a documented pattern of intimidation, and absolute certainty that I was right to fight. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in mid-January at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse, a downtown building where things were decided in rooms with fluorescent lighting and the particular bureaucratic gravity of places where people's lives are formally rearranged. Patricia had prepared me thoroughly. We had reviewed every document, every piece of evidence, every possible argument Derek's attorneys might raise. The photograph of Derek and Nicole, the text records establishing his communications with Nicole stretching back to August, a financial audit of the marital accounts that showed Derek had transferred $17,000 out of a joint savings account in October, 3 weeks after I announced the pregnancy, 1 week before he told me to leave. That transfer was, Patricia said, a critical piece. It showed premeditation. It showed that Derek Monroe had not reacted to a shock. He had executed a plan. I wore a dark blazer and flat shoes, and I arrived early, and I sat in the corridor outside the courtroom with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and my hands in my lap, and I breathed. Derek arrived with his attorney, a man named Harlan Briggs, who had the sleek, deliberate quality of someone who was very good at making straightforward things complicated. Derek did not look at me. He looked at the floor, at his phone, at Harlan Briggs. He looked like someone who had been told what to expect but was not entirely sure he believed it. Linda Monroe was seated in the gallery. She had, apparently, decided this required her presence. She sat very straight and wore a gray coat and looked at nothing in particular with the focused blankness of someone who is controlling themselves with effort. Patricia and Harlan Briggs argued. That is what lawyers do in these rooms. They argue in orderly, sequential ways, with documents and citations and the occasional objection. Harlan Briggs moved through the dispute in the order they'd anticipated. The property valuation, the paternity question, the alleged basis for the marital breakdown. And then Patricia laid out the evidence, the photograph, the text messages, the financial records showing the October transfer, a statement from Karen's colleague who had been present at the September event and was willing to put her name on what she had witnessed, and the recording, Linda Monroe, on a Tuesday afternoon in a coffee shop on Central Avenue, explicitly threatening to weaponize the legal system to delay proceedings and exhaust my financial resources if I did not withdraw the divorce filing. The courtroom did not go silent dramatically. Fluorescent-lit county courtrooms rarely do, but there was a particular quality of stillness that settled when Patricia finished, the kind that comes when one side of an argument has run out of places to go. Harlan Briggs requested a recess. The judge, a composed woman in her 50s named Judge Ellen Park, allowed 15 minutes. I sat in the corridor with Patricia. She did not celebrate. Patricia Odom was not a woman who celebrated before the ruling, but she allowed herself a very small, precise nod. In the gallery, I could see through the window in the courtroom door that Linda Monroe had risen from her seat and was speaking to Derek and Harlan Briggs in the kind of urgent, low-voiced way that meant she was not calm. Derek had his back partly to her. His face, in profile, looked like a man working very hard to keep something from showing. When we returned for the remainder of the hearing, Harlan Briggs withdrew the paternity challenge. He offered instead a stipulation. Derek acknowledged paternity, agreed to child support as calculated under North Carolina guidelines, and conceded the marital home would be subject to equitable distribution with my 60% occupancy claim granted. He argued, somewhat desperately, for a reduced property settlement on the basis of Derek's emotional distress. Judge Park did not appear moved by the emotional distress of Derek Monroe. She spoke for approximately 7 minutes. Her ruling covered the divorce decree, child support calculation, property division, and a notation on the record regarding the recorded intimidation attempt by a party's family member, Linda Monroe, which she referred to the clerk's attention. And then it was over. I stood in the corridor afterward with my jacket on my arm and my coffee still cold in my hand, and Derek Monroe walked past me without stopping. He was on his phone. His posture had changed. The easy broadness of his shoulders was gone, replaced by something smaller and more effortful. He did not look like a man who grilled on Sundays. He looked like a man who had been very certain about something and had turned out to be entirely wrong. Linda Monroe stopped in front of me. She held her gray coat closed at the collar as if against cold, though we were indoors. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who has many things to say and is recognized, possibly for the first time, that none of them will help. "I hope," she said finally, "that you're proud of yourself." I thought about that, about Karen's pull-out sofa and the 2 bags I'd packed in October, and the parking garage outside Dr. Reeves's office, and my mother saying, "Ask if you need it. Don't be proud." I thought about Thomas Ellery, who had known me and loved me in his quiet way and had left me something I had done nothing to deserve except be myself. "Yes," I said. "Actually, I am." I walked out into the January light. The final disbursement of Thomas Ellery's estate took place on a Friday morning in early March in Gerald Fitch's office on the 14th floor of the glass building on South Tryon Street. The divorce had been finalized in late January. Judge Park had signed the decree. The 30-day appeal window had passed without Derek filing anything, and I had legally been Claire Sayers again for 6 weeks when Gerald Fitch slid the transfer documentation across his desk. $45 million. I had known the number since October. I had lived with it in the abstract, had run calculations and spoken to a financial advisor Gerald recommended and thought about it in the dark of Karen's guest room while Biscuit breathed at my feet. But there is a difference between knowing a number and watching it appear in an account. I looked at the document. I looked at Gerald. He had the practiced equanimity of a man who had overseen many transactions but understood what this particular one meant to this particular person. "Congratulations," he said. "Thomas would be glad." I sat with that for a moment. Then I signed everything that needed signing, shook Gerald's hand, and went outside and stood on the sidewalk in the March air and called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good girl," in a voice that was not quite steady, and I laughed, and we stayed on the phone for a while without saying much else. The property settlement was finalized the following week. The townhouse had been valued at $412,000. I received my 60% share as a cash payout. Derek had elected to sell rather than buy me out, which meant the house went on the market in February and sold in 11 days. My share arrived in the account Gerald's recommended financial advisor had helped me open. I had already signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Plaza Midwood. Ground floor, small backyard, hardwood floors, enough room for Biscuit and a nursery. I painted the nursery pale yellow on a Saturday in mid-March, with Karen standing on a stepladder at one end of the room and my mother at the other, all 3 of us arguing pleasantly about whether the color was more butter or more lemon, and it was one of the best days I can remember. Child support was set at $3,200 a month, recalculable as Derek's income changed. Harlan Briggs had tried, in the final settlement negotiations, to argue for a lower figure based on Derek's transition expenses. Patricia Odom had looked at Harlan Briggs across the conference table in a way that required no response, and the number had stayed. Derek complied. He had no choice. The intimidation recorded in my meeting with Linda Monroe had been referred to the clerk, and while it did not result in formal sanctions, it was ultimately a family dispute, and North Carolina courts have limited appetite for punishing bad behavior that falls short of contempt. It was on the record. Harlan Briggs knew it was on the record. Derek knew it. Linda knew it. Patricia told me in our final billing meeting that the case had been, in her estimation, unusually clean. "You documented everything from the beginning," she said. "That's rare. People panic and react. You took notes." "I had a good teacher," I said, and meant Thomas Ellery, and also my mother, and also perhaps 10 years of managing logistics projects where everything had to be traceable. 2 weeks before my due date, I sent a short, formal letter to Derek through Patricia's office. It informed him of the expected birth timeline, reiterated the child support arrangement, and included the contact information for the pediatric practice I had selected. It was the most recent direct communication I had with him. He responded through Harlan Briggs, briefly and properly acknowledging receipt. My daughter was born on the 14th of April at Novant Health Presbyterian Medical Center at 7:40 in the morning after 11 hours of labor that I had not expected to be funny but was, in the way that extreme physical experiences sometimes produce unexpected clarity and even humor. My mother was in the room. Karen was in the waiting area with coffee and an inexhaustible supply of text messages. I named her Margaret, after my grandmother. She weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces and had dark hair and a face that was entirely, stubbornly, heartbreakingly her own. Derek was notified per the legal agreement. He came to the hospital 2 days later for a brief, formal visit that Patricia had recommended I allow and that went, in practice, about the way such visits go when two people have arrived at the specific and complete end of something. He held Margaret for 8 minutes. He was careful with her. He left before I had to speak more than 4 sentences to him. I watched him walk out of the hospital room and down the corridor, and I felt nothing dramatic, no triumph, no grief, just the clean, quiet sense of something closed. Margaret was in my arms. The room had afternoon light coming through the window. Biscuit was at home in the Plaza Midwood apartment, probably sitting on the sofa he wasn't supposed to be on. I had $45 million and a daughter, and my mother sitting in the chair by the bed, drinking bad hospital coffee, and the 41 days of January and February through which I had been most afraid were over. I had won. Not loudly, not cinematically. The way real victories happen, one documented step, one signed page, one spoken truth at a time, until the thing was done. By the time Margaret was 3 months old, I kept catching myself in the life I was building and being surprised by it. Surprised that the light in the Plaza Midwood apartment at 7 in the morning was so good. Surprised that I had learned to function on interrupted sleep in a way that felt less like deprivation and more like a different kind of time. Surprised, more than anything, that happiness, real, unguarded happiness, had the texture of ordinary things. A cup of coffee, Biscuit asleep under Margaret's crib, my mother on FaceTime, asking if the baby looked more like a Monroe or a Sayers, and both of us answering in the same breath. Sayers. In June, I met with a financial advisor named Denise Cartwright, recommended by Gerald Fitch, a woman of around my age with the particular gift of explaining large numbers without making you feel either small or reckless. We spent 3 sessions mapping out what I actually wanted. Not what I thought I was supposed to want, but what I, Claire Ann Sayers, actually wanted my life to look like, at 40, at 50, at whatever came after. What I wanted was a small company. I had spent 12 years in logistics coordination, and I knew, better than most people, how badly mid-sized businesses manage their supply chains. I had notes going back to 2019, gaps I'd identified, inefficiencies I'd mapped, systems I would have built differently if anyone had asked. No one had asked. Now I had the capital to build them myself. I incorporated Claire Sayers Consulting LLC in August. By the end of the year, I had 4 clients. By the following spring, I had 11. The work was not glamorous, spreadsheets and vendor calls and long conversations about freight routing. But it was mine, and being good at something that was yours turned out to feel completely different from being good at something that belonged to someone else. Margaret grew the way children grow, in ways that both stop your breath and make perfect sense in retrospect. She was opinionated from very early about food, about sounds, about who she wanted to be held by. She took to Biscuit immediately, and Biscuit matched her energy with a patience that sometimes made me feel instructed. Derek paid child support on time, every month. He exercised his parental visits, twice monthly for 2 hours, with a consistency I had not expected and which I recognized as, possibly, the truest good thing about him. Whatever he had failed at as a husband, he was trying not to fail at this. I heard about the rest of his life through Karen, who told me what she told me without embellishment. Nicole Pratt had ended the relationship in February, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. She had found the reality of Derek post-marriage less compelling than the version she'd known when he was someone else's problem. She relocated to Raleigh. Derek had not started another relationship and had been passed over for a senior partnership at his firm, the year of disruption having settled into the permanent record of his career. Linda Monroe. I heard about almost not at all, which felt correct. The clerk's notation from the divorce hearing had surfaced when she'd attempted to involve herself in a neighborhood association dispute, and the record had done what records do. She had become considerably less publicly active than before. I did not feel triumph about any of this. What I felt was free. In October, 1 year after I had sat in Karen's guest room with 2 bags and no plan, I took Margaret and Biscuit and my mother to the mountains outside Asheville. We stayed in a cabin with a porch looking out over the ridgeline, and Margaret watched the trees with the focused attention of someone encountering the world for the first time and finding it, on balance, acceptable. My mother sat next to me with coffee. "Are you happy?" she asked. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the mountains. I thought about Thomas Ellery, who had known something about me that I hadn't known yet, and who had made it possible for me to land somewhere instead of fall. "Yes," I said. "I actually am." Looking back, this is what I know. The moment Derek Monroe told me to leave his house, he had already made his choice. What he didn't understand was that he had also made mine. You cannot throw a woman away and expect her to stay thrown. You cannot underestimate the clarity that comes when someone strips everything away, because sometimes what's left is exactly enough. If someone had treated you the way Derek treated me, what would you have done? Would you have fought or walked away? Tell me in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more ahead. Thank you for listening.